The grease from the bag of fried chicken was beginning to turn translucent against the brown paper. A warm, heavy weight in Arthur's hand that felt strangely like an anchor as he stepped onto the gravel of the driveway. The air in the Cascades was different tonight, sharp, smelling of damp pine and the biting iron scent of coming snow. But as he approached the side door of the detached garage, the scent was replaced by the heavy, suffocating odor of motor, oil, and cold concrete. He had spent 20 years in the fake business, crawling through the dark, cramped underpinnings of other people's lives, and he had learned to read a room by its atmosphere before he ever saw the occupants. Tonight, the atmosphere in his own garage was toxic, a thick layer of unspoken malice that felt like static electricity against his skin. He stopped just short of the threshold, his work boots silent on the soft earth, when the sound of Tyler's voice drifted through the gap in the door. It wasn't the voice of the troubled stepson Arthur had tried to mentor for a decade. It was a voice stripped of all its youthful pretension, sounding hollow, low, and terrifyingly efficient. Tyler was on the phone, his silhouette cast in a jagged, flickering blue light from his smartphone screen, and the words he uttered, "Yeah, it's done. I already cut the line. See you at his funeral tomorrow," didn't just hit Arthur. They seemed to physically displace the air in his lungs. For a heartbeat, Arthur's entire world narrowed down to the sound of his own pulse, thundering in his ears, a rhythmic, panicked, drumming that drowned out the wind whistling through the Douglas firs. He stood there, frozen, the heat from the food in his hand mocking the sudden chill that had settled in his marrow. He stared at the sliver of light coming through the door, watching Tyler's shadow move with a casual grace. The boy's shoulders relaxed as if he had just finished a mundane chore, like taking out the trash rather than sabotaging a man's life. The true blow, however, didn't come from the boy he had raised, but from the silence that followed on the other end of the line. Arthur waited, every nerve ending screaming for Diane to interject, to weep, to scream, to tell her son he had lost his mind. He waited for the woman he had loved for 11 years to defend the home they had built together. Instead, her voice came through the speakerphone with a terrifying, clinical exhaustion that made Arthur's stomach drop into a void. She didn't ask why, and she didn't say stop. She simply asked if he was sure, her tone carrying the same weary pragmatism she used when discussing the monthly utility bills or the grocery list. That single question, "Are you sure?" shattered the last decade of Arthur's life more effectively than any physical strike ever could. It was the sound of a door closing forever. He realized then that he wasn't just a husband to her anymore. He was a problem to be solved, a line item to be erased from a ledger. The silence of the mountain night seemed to amplify every sound. He could hear the faint click of metal against the workbench as Tyler likely toyed with the tool he had used to sever the lines. Arthur's mind, trained to understand the mechanics of pressure and flow, immediately began to visualize the damage. He saw the hydraulic fluid weeping onto the concrete, the pedal going soft under his foot as he tried to navigate the hairpin turns of the past tomorrow morning. They weren't just killing him, they were letting the mountain do the work for them. He looked down at the bag of chicken, a pathetic, greasy peace offering from a man who thought he was coming home to a tense but salvageable marriage. He felt a wave of nausea so violent he had to lean his shoulder against the rough cedar siding of the garage to keep from collapsing. The hypocrisy of it was what burned the most away. Diane had kissed him goodbye that morning, the way Tyler had asked to borrow $20 just the day before. They had looked him in the eye while the timer on his life was already ticking. Patience had always been Arthur's primary tool, the mantra he gave to every apprentice who ever stripped a screw or rushed a pressure test, and now he forced himself to use it on his own shattered psyche. His first instinct was to roar, to kick the door open and wrap his hands around the neck of the boy who had just signed his death warrant. But he knew Tyler was 30 years younger and fueled by a sociopathic lack of consequence. He knew that if he walked in there now, he might not make it out of the garage alive. He had to be smarter. He had to be the machine. He became the ghost they already assumed he was, retreating into the darkness with the stealth of a man who had spent a lifetime navigating crawl spaces. His movements were dictated by a cold, mechanical survival instinct that had replaced his grief, The mountain air felt like ice against his cheeks as he backed away, his boots making no sound on the gravel he had spread himself 3 summers ago. Behind him, the house looked like a postcard of domestic bliss, a cruel mockery of the safety it was supposed to provide. The warm amber glow of the kitchen lights spilled onto the porch, illuminating the holiday wreath Diane had insisted on hanging just last week. It was a beautiful, lethal lie, a stage set designed to keep the neighbors from asking questions when the accident finally happened. As he reached the shadows of the tall pines where his old work sedan was parked, Arthur realized he couldn't go back inside. That house was no longer a home, it was a cage. He slid into the driver's seat of the sedan, the leather cold and cracked beneath him. His hands were shaking so violently he had to grip the steering wheel until his knuckles went white, the pressure helping to ground him in the reality of the moment. He stared through the windshield at the silver truck sitting in the driveway, the truck he had bought to keep his family safe in the snow, now turned into a 20,000-pound coffin. He reached for his phone, his thumb hovering over the emergency call button, but he stopped. The logic of a small mountain town was a jagged thing. He was the grumpy stepdad, the man who worked too much, the one who had been arguing with his wife lately. Tyler was the local kid, the one people made excuses for. Diane was the pillar of the church choir. If he called the police now, without a shred of proof, they would see a man having a breakdown, a man whose paranoia was finally getting the better of him. They would call it a domestic dispute. They would tell him to go for a walk and cool off, and while he was walking, Tyler would fix the line or hide the tools, and Arthur would be labeled the villain. No, he needed a witness. He needed someone who knew the soul of a machine. In the darkness of Tyler's heart, he turned the key. In the sedan's ignition, the engine turning over with a low, mournful growl that seemed to vibrate through his very bones. He didn't turn on the headlights until he had coasted down the long, winding driveway and reached the main road. As the red taillights of his house faded into the rearview mirror, Arthur felt the last shred of his old life tear away. He was alone, on the mountain, driving away from a murder scene that hadn't happened yet. But the air in the car already felt like a grave. The road away from the house felt like a descending spiral into a different dimension. Arthur drove with his headlights on low beam, the weak yellow light cutting through the swirling mist that had begun to settle over the mountain pass. Every shadow beneath the towering hemlocks looked like a figure waiting to step out, and every creak of his old sedan sounded like a mechanical failure in the making. His mind was a frantic engine, cycling through the images of the last hour, the blue light of the phone, the casual tilt of Tyler's head, and the terrifyingly calm timbre of Diane's voice. He kept checking his rearview mirror, half expecting to see the high beams of his own truck, the silver F-150, roaring up behind him to finish the job that the cut brake line was supposed to handle. He knew he was being irrational. The truck was sitting dead in the driveway, but fear has a way of rewriting the laws of physics in his mind. That truck was no longer a vehicle. It was a predator. The descent from the higher elevations of the Cascades toward the lower valley was a grueling 30-minute drive on a good day. Tonight, it felt like an eternity. Arthur's knuckles were white, his grip on the steering wheel so tight that his forearms began to ache with a dull, throbbing cramp. To keep himself from spiraling into a full-blown panic attack, he began to practice the sensory grounding techniques he had learned years ago. After a particularly bad accident on a job site, he felt the vibration of the road through the floorboards. He smelled the faint, dusty scent of the car's heater. He heard the rhythmic thrum-thrum of the tires over the asphalt expansion joints. But even as he tried to stabilize his mind, the betrayal kept leaking back in. He thought of the thousands of dollars he had spent on Tyler's legal fees over the years, the nights he had spent defending the boy to skeptical neighbors, and the way he had tried to be the father the boy's biological parent never was. It was a bitter irony that he was now fleeing to that very man for help. Silas Vance lived in a house that mirrored his soul, rugged, isolated, and built to withstand a siege. A retired master mechanic who had spent 35 years pulling engines apart and putting them back together, Silas was a man who understood the inherent honesty of metal. A machine didn't lie, It didn't pretend to love you while cutting your throat. Silas had been a hard man to his son, perhaps too hard, which was the wedge Diane had used to push Silas out of Tyler's life a decade ago. But Arthur knew that Silas possessed two things he desperately needed right now: an unbreakable moral code regarding machinery and the only pair of eyes in the county that Tyler actually feared. As the sedan rattled over the bridge crossing the Skykomish River, the dark water churning like liquid obsidian below, Arthur felt a flicker of something other than fear. It was the cold, hard spark of a plan. The turnoff to Silas's property was a narrow, unpaved track that chewed at the sedan's tires. Arthur killed the engine and sat in the sudden, deafening silence of the woods. The bag of fried chicken still sat on the passenger seat, now cold and smelling of stale salt, a tombstone for his marriage. He stepped out of the car, his boots crunching on the frost-covered gravel, and looked up at the small, sturdy cabin. A single light was on in the detached workshop behind the house. He walked toward it, his breath hitching in his chest. He wasn't just asking for a mechanic. He was asking a father to witness the ultimate sin of his son. It was a heavy burden to lay at an old man's feet, but Arthur had no other moves left. On the board, he reached the workshop door and knocked 3 heavy, deliberate strikes. The sound of a metal grinder died down inside, followed by the heavy tread of work boots. When the door swung open, Silas Vance stood there, framed by the amber glow of industrial shop lights. He was wearing a grease-stained flannel shirt, his hands black with old oil that had long since stained his pores. He looked at Arthur, then at the old sedan, then back at Arthur's face. Silas didn't say hello. He didn't offer a greeting. He saw the hollowed-out look in Arthur's eyes, and the way his hands were shoved deep into his pockets to hide the tremors. Silas stepped back, gesturing with a heavy, calloused hand for Arthur to enter the warmth of the shop. "You look like a man who just saw his own ghost, Arthur," Silas said, his voice like gravel grinding together. Arthur walked to a stool near a disassembled transmission and sat down, the adrenaline finally beginning to leave his system, replaced by a crushing, soul-deep fatigue. He didn't know how to start. How do you tell a man that his flesh and blood is a murderer in waiting? He looked around the shop, the organized rows of wrenches, the scent of solvent, the order of it all. It was a place of truth. He took a shaky breath, the words feeling like shards of glass in his throat. He told Silas about the garage. He told him about the phone call. He told him about the funeral tomorrow. As he spoke, Silas's expression didn't change, but his eyes, sharp and piercing behind thick glasses, seemed to grow colder with every sentence. When Arthur finally reached the part about Diane, about her asking if Tyler was sure, Silas turned away and picked up a rag, wiping his hands with a slow, deliberate intensity. "I tried to tell you 10 years ago, Arthur," Silas said quietly, not looking up. "Some things are born with a crack in the casting. You can weld them, you can paint them, you can try to reinforce them all you want, but when the pressure hits, they're going to fail. My boy, he's been a failed casting since he was 12 years old. I need you to look at the truck." "Silas," Arthur whispered, "I can't call the cops yet. They'll think I'm the one who's cracked. I need a report. I need a witness who can't be bought or bullied." Silas finally looked at him, and for the first time, Arthur saw a flicker of genuine pity in the old man's eyes. It was the look a veteran gives a new recruit who has just realized the war is real. Silas reached for his heavy canvas coat hanging on a peg and grabbed a high-powered industrial flashlight. He didn't ask if Arthur was sure. He didn't ask if he was mistaken. He knew Arthur, and he knew Tyler. "I've got a flatbed trailer and a winch," Silas said, his voice regaining its mechanical authority. "We're going to go get that truck right now. We're going to pull it out of that driveway in the middle of the night, and we're going to bring it here. If he cut those lines, I'll find the tool marks, I'll find the intent, and then, Arthur, we're going to make sure they never get to sit in the front row of that funeral they're so excited about." The two men walked out into the biting cold, the silence of the mountains no longer feeling like a threat, but like a shroud. Arthur got back into his sedan, following the heavy roar of Silas's dually truck as they began the climb back up the mountain. The mission had changed. He wasn't just a victim running away anymore. He was a man returning to the scene of his own planned demise, to gather the nails for Tyler's coffin. As they crested the final ridge, Arthur looked at the clock on his dashboard. It was nearly midnight. The world was asleep, and his wife was likely lying in their bed, dreaming of a life without him. He felt a cold, hard resolve settle in his chest. Patience was his tool, but tonight, Silas Vance was his hammer. The drive back up the mountain felt like a funeral procession where the corpse was still breathing. Arthur followed the glowing red taillights of Silas's heavy-duty dually, the massive flatbed trailer rattling behind it like a skeletal tail. The higher they climbed, the thicker the fog became, clinging to the windshield of Arthur's sedan like a damp shroud. Every mile closer to the house felt like a mile deeper into a trap. He had barely escaped. He kept his eyes fixed on Silas's truck, drawing strength from the old man's unwavering, mechanical steadiness. Silas didn't drive like a man on a mission of vengeance. He drove like a man going to fix a broken furnace, methodical, slow, and inevitable. Arthur, meanwhile, felt his heart hammering against his ribs with such force it made his vision pulse. He was returning to the place where his death had been discussed with the same casualness as a weather report, and the closer he got, the more the air in the car seemed to thin out. When they finally turned onto the long, gravel drive of Arthur's property, he felt a primal urge to slam on the brakes and put the car in reverse. The house was dark now, except for a single dim light in the upstairs hallway and the flickering blue glow of the television in the living room. It looked peaceful from the outside. It was the picture of a quiet mountain life, tucked away under the protective canopy of ancient firs. But Arthur saw the truth now. He saw the silver F-150 sitting in the driveway like a baited trap, its chrome grille glinting under the pale moon. It looked innocent, but Arthur knew that beneath its hood, the lifeblood of the machine, the hydraulic fluid, was waiting to fail. He pulled the sedan into the shadows of the tree line, cutting the engine before the vibration could alert anyone inside. Silas, however, didn't hide. He backed the massive flatbed toward the front of the F-150 with the practiced ease of a man who had spent 40 years in a shipyard. The roar of his diesel engine was deafening in the stillness of the mountain night. A mechanical challenge thrown at the silent house. Arthur stepped out of his car, the cold air hitting him like a physical blow. He moved toward Silas, his feet crunching softly on the frost, his eyes locked on the darkened windows of the master bedroom. He expected the front door to fly open at any second. He expected Tyler to come charging out with a tire iron, or Diane to appear on the porch in her robe, her face a mask of practiced confusion. But the house remained silent, a tomb made of cedar and glass. Silas hopped out of his cab, his heavy work boots hitting the gravel with a sound like a gunshot. He didn't look at Arthur. He was already focused on the truck. He clicked on his industrial flashlight, the beam a searing white blade that cut through the mountain mist. Get the winch cable. Silas muttered, his breath hitching in the cold. Don't touch the brakes. Don't even put your foot in the cab. If the pressure is low, any movement could cause a leak that messes with the evidence. We're dragging this thing up dead. Arthur moved to the back of the trailer, his hands numb. As he unspooled the heavy steel cable, the metal felt like ice biting into his palms, but he welcomed the pain. It gave him something to focus on other than the crushing fear of being seen. He knelt in the dirt, hooking the cable to the truck's frame with trembling fingers. He felt like a thief in his own home, a man stealing back his own life from those who sought to end it. Just as he tightened the hook, a light snapped on in the garage. Arthur froze, his heart stopping mid-beat. The side door of the garage creaked open, and Tyler stepped out, squinting against the glare of Silas's headlights. He was wearing an oversized hoodie, his hands shoved into the front pocket, looking every bit like the bored, aimless young man he pretended to be. What the hell? Tyler's voice drifted across the driveway, sounding more annoyed than surprised. Arthur, what are you doing, man? It's midnight. Arthur stood up slowly, his shadow stretching long and jagged across the gravel. He saw Tyler's eyes flick from the flatbed to Silas, and then back to Arthur. He saw the moment Tyler recognized his biological father. The boy's posture changed instantly. The casual slouch vanished, replaced by a rigid, defensive tension. Tyler took a step forward, his jaw tightening. "Dad." Tyler's voice dropped an octave, dripping with a strange mixture of resentment and sudden, sharp alertness. "What is he doing here? Arthur, why are you hooking up the truck?" Silas didn't look up from the winch controls. "Truck's broken, boy," he said, his voice flat and dangerous. "Arthur called me. Said he didn't trust the feel of it. I'm taking it to the shop to see why a perfectly good machine would suddenly decide to fail on a man." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crack bone. Arthur watched Tyler's face. In the harsh glare of the work lights, he saw the flickering of 1,000 different lies behind the boy's eyes. Tyler looked at the front of the truck, then at the garage where he had stood just hours before. He was calculating, trying to figure out how much Arthur had heard, how much Silas knew, and how he could spin this into just another one of Arthur's outbursts. "There's nothing wrong with the truck," Tyler said, his voice rising, gaining a frantic edge. "I drove it this morning. It was fine." "Arthur, you're being crazy again." Mom, come out here." As if on cue, the front door of the house opened. Diane stood in the doorway, the light from the hallway silhouetting her thin frame. She looked small, vulnerable, the perfect image of a worried wife. She stepped onto the porch, her hands clutched at her throat. "Arthur, what's going on? Why? Is Silas here?" Arthur looked at her, and for the first time in 11 years, he didn't see the woman he loved. He saw a stranger. He saw the silence she had offered in the garage. He saw the "Are you sure?" That had been his death warrant. He felt a sudden, icy calm wash over him. The fear didn't vanish, but it solidified into a weapon. "The truck isn't safe, Diane," Arthur said, his voice sounding strange and distant to his own ears, like it was coming from a man 100 miles away. "I'm having Silas take it. I don't want to talk about it tonight. I'm tired, and I'm going to stay at a motel." "Arthur, don't be ridiculous," Diane said, stepping down the porch stairs, her voice sweet and pleading, the same tone she used to talk him out of his frustrations. "It's freezing. Just come inside. Let Tyler unhook the cable. We can talk about this in the morning over coffee." "Silas, thank you for coming. But we've got it from here." Silas finally looked up, his eyes locking onto Diane's with the intensity of a predator. He didn't speak to her. He spoke to the air between them. "The winch is engaged. This truck is leaving this property. Anyone tries to stop me, I'm calling the sheriff and telling him I'm retrieving stolen property." "You want to have that conversation at 1 in the morning?" Diane stopped in her tracks. She knew Silas Vance. She knew he was a man of his word. And she knew he was the one person in this world who couldn't be manipulated by her tears or her soft words. She looked at Tyler, a silent communication passing between mother and son, a desperate, wordless check-in to see if the plan was still salvageable. Tyler looked at the truck as it began to groan under the tension of the winch, the tires sliding slowly across the gravel. He looked like he wanted to jump on the flatbed, like he wanted to rip the cable off with his bare hands. But he stayed where he was, his hands clenched into fists inside his hoodie. "Fine," Tyler spat, his face twisted in a sneer. "Take the piece of junk. But don't come crying to us when you have to pay for the tow, Arthur. You're losing your mind." Arthur didn't answer. He watched as his truck, the silver F-150 he had been so proud of, was dragged onto the steel bed of the trailer. It felt like watching a crime being committed in reverse. As Silas secured the last tie-down strap, Arthur walked back to his sedan. He didn't look at Diane, even as she called his name one last time, her voice cracking with a faint heartbreak that made his skin crawl. He got into the car, his hands steady on the wheel for the first time all night. Silas climbed back into his cab, gave a single, sharp nod through the rearview mirror, and pulled away as Arthur followed the trailer down the long driveway. He looked back in the mirror. Diane and Tyler were standing together under the porch, light to small figures dwarfed by the dark, towering trees. They looked like a family. But as the fog swallowed them up, Arthur knew the truth. The trap had been sprung, but the prey had escaped. Now, all that was left was to see what the machine had to say. The drive back to Silas's workshop felt like traversing a bridge between two lives. Behind them lay the wreckage of a marriage and a home that had turned into a hunting ground. Ahead lay the cold, clinical truth of a workshop. The silence inside Arthur's sedan was thick enough to choke on. He watched the F-150 swaying slightly on the back of the flatbed, its hazard lights blinking rhythmically, casting intermittent red splashes against the dark Cascades foliage. It looked like a wounded beast being hauled to a surgeon. Arthur felt a strange, hollow detachment. The adrenaline that had spiked when Tyler stepped out of the garage had faded into a leaden exhaustion that pulled at his eyelids, yet he knew sleep was an impossibility. He was waiting for the machine to speak. Silas didn't waste a second once they reached the shop. He backed the trailer into the bay with a roar of diesel exhaust and a hiss of air brakes. The workshop was a cathedral of order, lit by high intensity LED panels that turned the midnight hour into a synthetic noon. Silas moved with a focused, predatory energy. He operated the winch with a delicate touch, easing the silver truck off the flatbed and onto a heavy-duty twin-post lift. He didn't speak to Arthur, and Arthur didn't expect him to. In the space, Silas was the high priest, and the ritual was about to begin. Arthur stood back, leaning against a steel workbench, his hands buried deep in his jacket pockets. The cold bag of chicken was still in the car, forgotten, a relic of a man who no longer existed. "Stay back," Silas grumbled, his voice echoing off the corrugated metal walls. "I want to document the pressure before I even get under there." Silas climbed into the driver's seat with a grunt. He didn't start the engine. He reached out with a gloved hand and pressed the brake pedal. Even from 10 feet away, Arthur heard the sickening, muffled thud as the pedal hit the floorboard with zero resistance. Silas did it again, pump, pump, thud. He didn't say anything, but his jaw tightened until the muscles stood out like corded rope. He climbed out, grabbed a high-lumen inspection lamp, and hit the switch for the hydraulic lift. With a mechanical whine, the F-150 rose into the air, its tires dangling, exposing its underbelly to the harsh, unforgiving light. Arthur stepped closer, drawn by a morbid fascination. He had worked on furnaces, boilers, and complex ventilation systems for decades. He understood the language of lines and flow. He followed Silas under the truck. The old mechanic moved the light slowly, tracing the silver-colored brake lines that ran like veins along the frame rail. For a few minutes, there was only the sound of their breathing and the faint tink-tink of the cooling exhaust. Then, Silas stopped. The beam of his light narrowed and focused on a section of the line, just above the rear axle, tucked behind a mounting bracket. "There," Silas whispered. It wasn't a cry of triumph. It was a sound of profound, weary disappointment. Arthur leaned in. At first, it just looked like a wet patch, a dark stain of hydraulic fluid glistening like oil on a rainy street. But as Silas wiped away the excess with a clean white rag, the truth emerged with surgical clarity. The steel line hadn't burst. It hadn't rusted. It hadn't been pinched by a rock or frayed by road debris. There was a clean, diagonal skrmarka, deliberate incision that had thinned the metal until the internal pressure of the first heavy braking maneuver would cause it to fail. It was the work of a tubing cutter, used with just enough pressure to compromise the line without severing it instantly. It was a timed death sentence. "That's a tubing cutter," Arthur said, his voice a dry rasp, "a quarter-inch plumber's tool. I have 3 of them in my garage." "It's not just a cut, Arthur," Silas said, pointing with a grease-stained finger. "See the angle. He didn't go all the way through because he wanted you to get a few miles down the road. He wanted you on the pass. If he'd cut it through, the warning light would have hit as soon as you started the truck in the driveway. This was meant to let you get up to 60 miles an hour before you realized you had nothing under your foot." The reality of it hit Arthur like a physical weight, forcing him to sit down on a nearby rolling stool. He pictured the hairpin turn near Deception Falls, the sheer drop-off, the icy spray from the river below. Tyler knew that route. Tyler knew Arthur took that pass every Friday for his coastal accounts. It wasn't just murder, it was an execution, designed to look like a tragic mechanical failure on a dangerous road. Silas reached into a drawer and pulled out a macro lens camera. He began taking photos. The flash strobing against the undercarriage, he photographed the cut, the fluid patterns, the frame rail, and the tool marks. He worked with the grim efficiency of a forensic investigator. "You see this here?" Silas asked, gesturing to a tiny shard of curled metal at the edge of the cut. "That's from a fresh blade. A dull one would have crushed the line slightly. This was a new tool, or a new blade." "Buddy Harlan," Arthur muttered, remembering the name of his friend who owned the local hardware shop. "Tyler was there yesterday. I saw his truck in the lot when I was driving to a job. I didn't think anything of it. I thought he was just hanging out." Silas finished the photos and set the camera down on a clean cloth. He looked at Arthur, and for the first time, the old man's stoic mask slipped. There was a raw, jagged grief. In his eyes, the look of a man who had realized his own legacy was a poison. "My son did this," Silas said, the words sounding like they were being torn out of him. "I raised a monster under my own roof, and I let him loose on a good man. I'm sorry, Arthur. I am so goddamn sorry. It's not on you, Silas," Arthur said, though the words felt hollow. "He's 30 years old. He made his choice, and Diane, she made hers. That's the part I don't get," Silas said, pacing the length of the bay. "The boy is a sociopath. I've known that since he killed the neighbor's cat at 10. But Diane, she's a mother. How does a mother sit there and watch her son sharpen the blade for her husband?" "Maybe she stopped seeing me as a husband a long time ago," Arthur replied. "Maybe I was just the insurance policy. The house is paid off. The business is worth a fair bit. Tyler's in debt up to his neck, and she always did choose him. No matter what he stole, no matter who he hurt. He was always her sweet boy who just needed another chance. I guess I was the only thing standing in the way of his last chance." Silas walked over to the workbench and picked up his phone. He looked at Arthur, a question in his eyes. "We call the sheriff now. I've got the photos. I've got the truck. I'll sign the affidavit as a master mechanic. They can't ignore this, Arthur. Not even in this town." Arthur looked at the F-150, hanging in the air like a ghost. He thought about the house on the mountain, the quiet hallways, and the woman he had shared a bed with. He thought about the funeral tomorrow. He felt a strange, cold peace settle over him. The time for grieving was over. The time for being the patience man was over. "No," Arthur said, standing up. "We don't call the sheriff yet. If we call him now, Tyler will see the lights coming. He'll have time to ditch the tools, or Diane will concoct some story about how I'm trying to frame them. We wait until morning. I want to see their faces when I don't go off that mountain. I want them to think the plan is working until the very second the handcuffs click." Silas stared at him for a long beat. Then a slow, grim smile touched the corners of his mouth. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the look of a man who appreciated a well-set trap. "You've got a mean streak in you after all, Arthur," Silas said. "I'm not mean, Silas," Arthur said, walking toward the door to look out at the dark, indifferent mountains. "I'm just a man who's tired of being the only one following the rules. Let's get some coffee. It's going to be a long night." The pre-dawn light in Silas's workshop was a cold, bruised purple, filtering through the high clerestory windows and catching the dust motes that danced over the belly of the suspended truck. Arthur sat at a scarred wooden desk in the corner, a mug of black coffee cooling in his hands. He hadn't slept a wink. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt the sickening lurch of a vehicle losing its grip on the world. Silas was in the back, hunched over a laptop, his thick fingers pecking at the keys with a grim focus. They weren't just looking at mechanical failures anymore. They were looking at the legal architecture of a counter-strike. Silas was drafting a formal mechanical inspection report, timestamping every photo, and cross-referencing the tool marks with the specifications of standard plumbing. "Cutters, if you're going to do this, Arthur, you have to do it clean," Silas said without looking up. "The moment you walk back into that world, they are going to try to paint you as the aggressor. You're the one who stole the truck in the middle of the night. You're the one who's been stressed and acting out. We need a paper trail that starts before the sun comes up." Arthur nodded, the logic of it settling into his bones. He reached for his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. Elena Vance. She was Silas's niece, a sharp-edged defense attorney in Seattle who had made a career out of dismantling, he said. She said domestic cases with cold, hard forensics. When she picked up on the third ring, her voice was alert, sensing the gravity of a midnight call. From her uncle's shop, Arthur laid it out: the garage, the phone call, the cut line, and the fact that his wife was standing right there beside the predator. "Arthur, listen to me very carefully," Elena said, her voice is soothing but authoritative. "Hum over the line. Do not go back to that house alone. In fact, don't go back at all. If Diane calls, do not answer. If Tyler texts, do not reply. Silence is your best witness right now. Every word you say to them is something they can twist into menace. I'm leaving Seattle now. I'll meet you at the sheriff's station in 2 hours. Silas. I want those photos uploaded to a secure cloud drive immediately." "Arthur, do you have your dashcam footage?" Arthur paused. He hadn't even thought of the dashcam in the sedan. It's always running when the ignition is on. It would have recorded my arrival at the house and the entire conversation with Tyler. And Diane in the driveway. "Perfect," Elena said. "That's your evidence of your own calm demeanor versus their escalation. It proves you weren't raging. It proves you were securing property. Now, Arthur, I need you to think: did Diane have access to your bank accounts or life insurance?" The question felt like a needle to the heart. Everything is joint. The life insurance is $1 million policy tied to the business. If I go over a cliff, she gets the house, the shop, and the payout. Tyler gets his debts erased. There's your motive, Elena stated flatly. It's as old as time. I'll handle the emergency filings to freeze the joint assets. We're going to file for a domestic violence protection order before the courthouse even opens for general business. In Washington, tampering with a vehicle to cause harm is an automatic felony. We aren't just getting a divorce, Arthur. We're putting them in a cage. After he hung up, Arthur felt a strange, hollow sensation in his chest. It was the feeling of a man watching his own life being dismantled and reassembled into a court case. He looked at Silas, who was now printing out the report. The old man looked aged, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his son's sins. Silas handed him the folder, the paper still warm from the printer. "This is the truth, Arthur," Silas said. "It's the only thing that's going to stay upright when the wind starts blowing. Tyler is going to lie. Diane is going to cry. But this piece of steel, it doesn't know how to do either." Arthur walked out to the sedan. The cold mountain air was starting to stir as the sun began to peek over the jagged peaks of the Cascades. He checked his phone. There were 16 missed calls from Diane and 4 texts from Tyler. The last one from Tyler was different from the others. "Hey man, sorry about last night. I was just stressed. Bring the truck back and let's grab breakfast. Mom's worried sick." The sheer audacity of the message, the grab breakfast while the brake line was still weeping fluid in Silas's shop, made Arthur's blood run cold. They weren't just trying to kill him. They were trying to gaslight him into coming back for a second attempt. He realized then that Tyler wasn't just a troubled kid. He was a hunter who had missed his first shot and was now trying to whistle the prey back into the clearing. "He's trying to lure me back," Arthur said, showing the screen to Silas. Silas spat on the gravel. He's scared. He realized he didn't see the accident on the news this morning, and now he's wondering if he left something behind. He's trying to get that truck back so he can fix the evidence. "Don't you dare answer him." Arthur didn't. He got into the sedan and sat there for a moment, watching the mist roll off the Skykomish River. He thought about the man he was yesterday, a man who worried about furnace filters and grocery lists, and whether his stepson liked him. That man was gone. In his place was someone who understood that the most dangerous predators don't live in the woods. They sit at your dinner table and ask you how your day was. As he pulled out of Silas's driveway, Arthur saw a black SUV pass him, heading towards Silas's cabin. It was Buddy Harlan's truck. Buddy was the one who owned the hardware store where Tyler had bought the cutter. Arthur pulled over and rolled down his window. Buddy looked pale, his hands gripping the steering wheel tight. "Arthur," Buddy called out, his voice shaking. "I saw the news about a stolen truck on the Neighborhood Watch app. Diane is posting everywhere that you've had a breakdown. But Arthur, I saw Tyler in my shop 2 days ago. He bought a specialized tubing cutter. He asked me how to use it on stainless steel lines. I didn't think, I thought he was helping you with a job. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Not just the act, but the preparation. The witness Arthur needed hadn't just appeared. He had come to him out of guilt. "Buddy," Arthur said, his voice steady and cold, "I need you to follow me to the sheriff's station. You're the one who sold him the weapon, the small convoy Arthur." In his sedan, Buddy and his SUV began the drive toward the town of Sultan. The sun was fully up now, illuminating the breathtaking beauty of the mountains. A beauty that now felt like a mask for the jagged, lethal reality underneath. Arthur looked at the folder on the seat beside him. "Patience is my tool," he thought, "and today, I'm going to use it to rebuild a life that doesn't include a grave." The sheriff's station in Sultan was a squat, unassuming building of brick and glass that sat in the shadow of the mountain peaks, looking far too small to handle the gravity of what Arthur was carrying inside. As Arthur stepped out of his car, the morning air felt thin and brittle. He was met at the entrance by Elena Vance. She was exactly as Silas had described, a woman of sharp angles and even sharper eyes, dressed in a charcoal suit that looked like armor. She didn't offer a hug or a platitude. She simply took the folder from Arthur's hand, flipped through Silas's report, and nodded once. "The narrative is already moving against you, Arthur," Elena said, her voice a low, focused hum as they walked toward the heavy glass doors. "Diane has been busy. She's reached out to the local parish, the neighborhood watch, and even the sheriff's sister. She's playing the part of the terrified wife whose husband has suffered a psychotic break and fled with the family vehicle. If we don't fix this in the next 60 minutes, you're going to be picked up on a mental health warrant." Inside, the station smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. They were ushered into a small interview room by Detective Miller, a man with a face like a topographical map who had known Arthur for a decade. Miller looked at Arthur with a mixture of pity and skepticism, the look of a man who had already heard Diane's version of the story 3 times before breakfast. Arthur felt the familiar flare of frustration, but he remembered the mantra, "Patience is my tool." He sat down, kept his hands flat on the table, and let Elena lead. Detective Elena began, her voice cutting through the room's tension like a scalpel. "We aren't here to discuss a marriage. We are here to report a premeditated attempted murder. We have physical evidence of vehicle tampering, a witness who sold the suspect the tool, and a mechanical expert's affidavit. My client isn't having a breakdown, he's having a survival." As Silas's photos were spread across the table, the jagged, calculated score marks on the brake lines, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Detective Miller leaned in, his skepticism replaced by a cold, professional curiosity. He traced the line of the cut in the photo with a callous thumb. Arthur watched the detective's eyes. He saw the moment Miller realized this wasn't a domestic squabble. No one accidentally scores a brake line with a tubing cutter. It was a signature of intent. The interrogation took hours. Arthur had to recount every second of the night before, the smell of the fried chicken, the blue glow of the phone, the specific cadence of his wife's betrayal. He felt like he was being flayed alive, his private grief laid bare on a cold laminate table for the sake of a police report. Outside in the lobby, Buddy Harlan sat on a plastic chair, twisting his hat in his hands, waiting to give his statement about the sale of the tool. The weight of the community was beginning to shift. In a small town, a rumor is a fire, but a police report is a firebreak. While they were in the room, Arthur's phone buzzed incessantly. Elena had instructed him to leave it on the table. Screen up. A text from Diane flashed across the screen. "Arthur, please. The police are asking questions. Just tell me where you are so I can help you. I love you." Detective Miller looked at the message, then back at the photos of the cut brake line. He let out a slow, heavy breath. "She's good," Miller whispered. "If I hadn't seen these photos, I'd be at your house right now trying to talk you into a voluntary hold." By noon, the investigation had officially pivoted. It was no longer a welfare check on a missing husband. It was a felony investigation into Tyler Vance and Diane. Miller stood up, adjusting his belt. "Arthur, I need you to stay here." "Elena, I'm getting a warrant for the garage and a seizure order for the tools. We're also pulling the cell tower pings for Tyler's phone from last night. If he was in that garage when he said he was on the phone, we've got him. as the squad cars pulled out of the station. Sirens silent, but lights flashing, Arthur sat in the lobby with a paper cup of water. He felt a strange, hollow victory. The truth was finally in the hands of the people. Who could enforce it? But the cost was his entire world. He looked out the window at the town of Sultan. People were going about their day buying gas, picking up mail, laughing at the diner. They had no idea that a few miles up the mountain, a man's life had been traded for an insurance policy. Elena sat down next to him, her expression softening for the first time. The shift is happening, Arthur. Diane's Facebook post about your breakdown was just taken down. People are starting to ask why the sheriff is at your house with a crime scene unit instead of an ambulance. The narrative is yours now. But be ready when a cornered animal realizes the trap has moved. It bites. Arthur looked at his hands. They had finally stopped shaking. He thought about the mountain pass, the sheer drop-offs, and the way the brake pedal would have felt as it hit the floor. He realized that the person who had been scared for the last 11 years wasn't him. It was the boy and the woman who were so afraid of a life without his money that they were willing to kill for it. Let them bite, Arthur said quietly. I've spent 20 years fixing things that were broken. Today, I'm just going to let this stay broken. The afternoon sun was high now, illuminating the snow-capped peaks of the Cascades. For the first time since he had heard Tyler's voice in the dark, Arthur felt like he could take a full breath of air. He wasn't safe yet, and the courtroom battle was a mountain he still had to climb. But he was no longer the prey. He was the witness. And as the first reports of a domestic arrest began to ripple through the local radio scanner, Arthur closed his eyes and finally, for just a moment, let himself feel the weight of the life he had saved. The arrest didn't happen in the dark of night, which was perhaps the most devastating blow to Diane's carefully constructed reputation. It happened at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, under the bright, judgmental glare of a high mountain sun. Arthur sat in the passenger seat of Detective Miller's unmarked cruiser, parked at the base of his own driveway. Elena had insisted he be present not to participate, but to ensure there was no ambiguity about who was in control of the narrative. Behind them, two marked units from the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office sat idling, their diesel engines. A low, menacing growl that echoed off the cedar siding of the house. Arthur watched through the windshield, feeling like an observer to a movie based on a life he used to own. When the deputies stepped onto the porch, the front door opened almost instantly. Diane appeared first, her face already schooled into a mask of weary, saintly concern. She began to speak before the officers could even state their purpose, her hands fluttering to her chest in a gesture Arthur had once found endearing, but now recognized as a tactical maneuver. Officers, thank God, she cried, her voice carrying. Across the gravel, have you found Arthur? Is he okay? We've been worried sick. It was a masterclass in gaslighting, delivered with the conviction of a woman who believed her own lies. But the deputies didn't move to comfort her. They didn't ask about Arthur's welfare. Instead, Detective Miller stepped out of the car and walked toward the porch, his face as hard as the mountain granite. Diane, Miller said, skipping the formalities, we're here with a search warrant for the premises and a warrant for the arrest of Tyler Vance. Where is he? The transformation in Diane's face was instantaneous. The mask of the worried wife didn't just slip, it disintegrated. Her eyes darted toward the cruiser where Arthur sat, and for a fleeting second, their gazes locked through the glass. In that moment, the sweet, fragile Diane vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating fear that turned her features sharp and haggard. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The sound of a heavy boots hitting wood came from inside the house, followed by the crash of a window shattering at the back. Tyler was running. Arthur watched as the two deputies sprinted around the side of the house, their hands on their holsters. It was over in less than 3 minutes. Tyler didn't make it to the tree line. He tripped over a decorative stone border one. Arthur had spent a weekend hauling in from the river and was tackled into the damp mulch. From his vantage point, Arthur saw Tyler struggling, his face pressed into the dirt, his mouth twisted in a snarl of curses. When they hauled him up, his hands were zip-tied behind his back, and the front of his designer hoodie was stained with mud and pine needles. He didn't look like a mastermind. He looked like a cornered cur, snapping at the air. Diane was screaming. Now, a high, thin sound that brought the neighbors to their porches. He didn't do anything. Arthur is framing him. This is a mistake. She turned her fury on Miller, clutching at his arm. But the detective gently but firmly uncoupled her grip. As the deputies led Tyler toward the transport unit, they stopped by the garage. Following the directions Arthur had provided, they went straight to the third drawer of the red rolling toolbox. A deputy emerged moments later, holding a small plastic evidence bag. Inside was the quarter-inch tubing cutter Buddy Harlan had described, still glinting with a fresh, oily sheen. Tyler stopped dead when he saw the bag. He looked at the tool, then at the house, and finally at the cruiser where Arthur sat. The boy's face didn't show remorse. It showed a terrifying, incandescent rage. He lunged toward the car, screaming something muffled by the glass before. The deputy shoved him into the back seat of the transport. The sound of the door slamming shut felt like the final period on a very long, very painful sentence. Arthur felt a strange, cold shiver run down his spine. This was the boy he had taught to fish, the boy whose school projects he had stayed up late to finish. It was a grief that felt like an amputation. The limb was gone, and while the pain remained, there was no way to grow it back. Then came the hardest part, Diane. Miller approached the house again, this time with a second set of handcuffs. Diane Vance, you are being detained for questioning in relation to the solicitation of a felony and conspiracy to commit aggravated assault. She didn't fight. She didn't scream like Tyler had. She simply went limp, her eyes fixed on the driveway. As the metal ratcheted shut around her wrists, the neighbors, the church choir members, the grocery store clerks, the people who had spent the morning praying for her stood in a silent semicircle. At the edge of the road, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning horror. The myth of the perfect mountain family had been dismantled in front of the entire town. As Miller walked back to the cruiser, he leaned into the window. We've got the tool, Arthur. And we found Tyler's phone. He hadn't even deleted the search history for how to cut brake lines without a warning light. He was so arrogant he didn't think he'd ever have to hide his tracks. Arthur nodded, but he couldn't find his voice. He watched as the convoy of sirens began the slow descent down the mountain, carrying away the people who had shared his dinner table for 11 years. Elena, sitting in the back seat, leaned forward and placed a steadying hand on Arthur's shoulder. It's a long road from here to a conviction, Arthur, but the trap is closed. They can't hurt you anymore. Arthur looked at the house, the wreath on the door, the quiet windows, the empty driveway. It was just a building now, stripped of the ghosts that had haunted it. He realized that for years, he had been waiting for the peace Diane always promised, but he had finally found it in the one place he never expected, the back of a police cruiser. Watching his life burn to the ground, he took a breath, the cold mountain air finally feeling like it belonged to him again. Patience had been his tool, but the truth had been his shield. The courtroom in Sultan felt like a cold, hollow chamber where the echoes of Arthur's life were being scrutinized under a microscope. It wasn't the dramatic, wood-paneled arena of a television show. It was a functional, sterile room that smelled of industrial cleaner and damp coats. Arthur sat at the prosecution table next to Elena, his back straight, his eyes fixed on the seal of the state of Washington behind the judge's bench. He refused to look at the defense table, where Diane and Tyler sat with their respective state-appointed attorneys. He could feel the weight of their gaze. Diane's a heavy, wet blanket of feigned heartbreak, and Tyler's a sharp, jagged edge of pure defiance. Elena was a force of nature in the courtroom. She didn't rely on emotional appeals. She built a fortress out of facts. She moved through the evidence with a predatory precision. Starting with the dashcam footage from Arthur's sedan, the room fell into a heavy, uncomfortable silence as the audio played. The sound of Arthur's calm, shaking voice in the driveway contrasted against Tyler's aggressive sneers and Diane's manipulative pleas. Seeing it on a screen made the reality of that night undeniable. It wasn't a psychotic break or a misunderstanding. It was a man calmly securing his property while his family circled him like vultures. Then came the mechanical testimony. Silas Vance stood on the witness stand, his gray hair combed back, his voice steady, but thick with the effort of testifying against his own son. He explained the mechanics of the cut, his calloused hands gesturing to the high-resolution photos of the brake line. He described the intent behind the score mark, how it was designed to hold pressure until the vehicle reached a certain speed or encountered a steep grade. The judge, an older woman with a face like a winter apple, leaned forward, her eyes narrowing, as she looked at the evidence. The mechanical coincidence theory the defense was trying to float died a quick, silent death in the face of Silas's 40 years of expertise. The defense attorneys tried to claw back some ground by attacking Arthur's character. They brought up the tension in the house, the arguments over money, and Tyler's claim that Arthur had been verbally abusive. They tried to paint a picture of an aging man who had grown paranoid and vengeful, a man who had staged the tampering to rid himself of a stepson he never liked. Arthur listened to the lies with a strange sense of detachment. He realized that they were trying to gaslight the court, just as they had gaslighted him for a decade. But every time they tried to spin a story, Elena countered with a timestamp, a receipt, or a forensic report. The most chilling moment came when the prosecution played the recovered audio from Tyler's phone. He had recorded his conversation with Diane in the garage, not for posterity, but perhaps as a way to hold it over her head later. The voice that filled the courtroom was unmistakable. "He won't make it past the falls," Tyler had said, followed by a low, casual chuckle, and then came Diane's voice, a soft, weary exhale. "Just make sure it looks like he lost control on the ice." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. The church members who had come to support Diane suddenly looked away, their faces pale. The saintly wife was gone, replaced by the architect of a murder. As the judge issued the ruling to hold them both over for trial without bail, citing the overwhelming evidence and the danger to the victim, Arthur felt a massive weight lift from his shoulders. He didn't feel joy. He felt a profound, echoing emptiness. He watched as the bailiffs led them away, Tyler still staring at him with a frightening, silent intensity, and Diane finally breaking, her head bowed as she wept into her hands. It was the first time Arthur had seen her cry where he didn't feel the urge to go to her and fix it. The spell was finally, completely broken. Outside on the courthouse steps, the mountain wind bit at Arthur's face. Elena stood beside him, her job done for the day. "The civil filings are next, Arthur," she said. "We're freezing the accounts and starting the process to remove them from the deed of the house. It's going to be messy, but they've forfeited their right to any of it. You've won the battle of the truth." Arthur looked at the gray sky, the clouds swirling around the peaks. He had his life back, but it was a life made of wreckage. He realized that the hardest part of the story wasn't surviving the mountain pass. It was learning how to live in the silence that followed the storm. The legal aftermath was a slow, grinding machine that moved with the cold indifference of a mountain glacier. But by the time the final signatures were dry, Arthur felt as though he had been reborn in a different skin. The house in the Cascades, once his sanctuary and later his cage, was sold to a young couple from Seattle who saw only the breathtaking views and the sturdy cedar beams. Arthur didn't tell them about the garage. He didn't tell them about the shadows that lingered in the hallway or the way the wind sometimes sounded like a whispered betrayal. He took only his father's old toolbox, a few crates of books, and the clothes on his back, leaving the rest to be auctioned off or hauled away. He didn't want the furniture they had sat on. He didn't want the bed where the funeral had been. Whispered into the dark, with the proceeds from the sale and the recovered joint assets, Arthur bought a modest, single-story bungalow nestled on a quiet bend of the Skykomish River, miles away from the town of Sultan and the people who still whispered his name at the grocery store. His new home didn't have a detached garage or a long, winding driveway that could hide a predator. It had a wide, wooden deck that overlooked the water, where the river moved with a constant, cleansing energy, carrying the mountain's debris toward the sea. He spent his mornings sitting there with a mug of coffee, watching the eagles hunt and the mist lift off the water. The silence here wasn't heavy or tactical. It was just peace. Diane and Tyler were gone, swallowed by the state correctional system. The trial had been a grim formality after the forensic evidence and the phone recordings were presented. Tyler had received a lengthy sentence for attempted first-degree murder. his arrogance finally crushed under the weight of a judge who had no patience for troubled men with two big cutters. Diane, found guilty of conspiracy and solicitation, had been sentenced to a shorter but equally definitive term. Arthur hadn't attended the sentencing. He didn't need to hear their final pleas or see their faces. He had already delivered his testimony, and the truth had done the rest of the work. One crisp October afternoon, Silas Vance pulled into Arthur's gravel drive in his old dually truck. The two men sat on the deck, the only two people in the world who truly understood the cost of what had happened. Silas looked older, his hands trembling slightly as he held his glass of iced tea, the weight of his son's legacy finally settling into his bones. They didn't talk about the trial or the truck. They talked about the river, the salmon run, and the way the cedar trees turned a deeper shade of green before the first frost. "You doing all right, Arthur?" Silas asked, his voice low and gravelly. Arthur looked out at the river, watching a stray branch get caught in an eddy before being swept downstream. "I'm breathing, Silas," he said, and for the first time in years, he meant it. "I spent my whole life fixing things that were broken, thinking that if I just worked hard enough, I could keep the heat on and the water flowing. I didn't realize that some things aren't meant to be fixed. Some things are just meant to be survived." Silas nodded, a slow, solemn movement. Patience is a hell of a tool, but it's the hardest one to put back in the box when the job is done. When Silas left, Arthur walked down to the water's edge. He felt the cold dampness of the river air on his skin and the solid earth beneath his boots. He thought about the man who had stood in the dark garage with a bag of fried chicken, a man who had been so desperate for a normal night that he almost walked straight into his own grave. That man was a stranger to him now. He realized that wisdom wasn't just about knowing how a machine worked. It was about knowing when the machine was rigged to explode. He had lost his home, his marriage, and his sense of safety, but he had gained the one thing that no insurance policy could ever cover: his own soul. Intact and unburdened by the lies of others, the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks of the Cascades, casting a long, golden light across the water. Arthur turned back toward his small, brightly lit bungalow. He had a new furnace to install for a neighbor tomorrow and a quiet evening ahead of him. He wasn't looking over his shoulder anymore. He wasn't listening for whispers in the dark. He was just a man living his life, one steady breath at a time. He had stepped aside, let the truth do the hitting, and for the first time in 58 years, Arthur was truly, finally, home. If you like history, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.